In the 1980s, the Lloyd's insurance market in London embraced an exciting financial innovation. The idea of this innovation was to move risk to those places where they were most able to bear it. And that might sound like the epitome of resilience. And yet at the same time as I describe that, you might be thinking to yourself, that rings a faint bell. Well, that makes you slightly uneasy. And the reason it might make you uneasy is because you may recall that's pretty much exactly the sales pitch that Alan Greenspan was making for credit derivatives in 2006 and 2007, just before the financial crisis broke. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but the credit derivatives story didn't really end that well. I thought you might be interested to hear how the insurance story ended. So the financial innovation in question was to do with a tweak to an old concept called reinsurance. Now, reinsurance has a very sound business logic. The idea is you're an insurance company, you're insuring something really big like a skyscraper. If something happens to that skyscraper, well, you're probably not actually going to be able to afford to pay the claim. And so you need to team up with other insurance companies who will take some of that risk away from you, and that's reinsurance. And the tweak that the Lloyd's insurance market made to reinsurance doesn't seem like a big deal. Instead of insuring a particular event, they would instead insure a whole package, reinsure a whole package. So if an insurance syndicate was just having a bad year because a bunch of stuff had happened, other insurance syndicates could, for a fee, step in and take away some of those losses. That doesn't seem too sinister. Well, here's what happened. Imagine insurance syndicate A. It's having a bad year. Fortunately, it has a reinsurance contract with insurance syndicate B. So insurance syndicate A passes the losses to insurance syndicate B. Well, now insurance syndicate B is having a bad year, for no reason other than the reinsurance contract with insurance syndicate A. Fortunately, insurance syndicate B has a reinsurance contract with insurance syndicate C. So it takes the losses and they get passed to insurance syndicate C. Now, insurance syndicate C was doing fine, but now it's having a bad year. But never fear, because insurance syndicate C has a reinsurance contract with insurance syndicate A. And so the losses go from A to B to C to A to B to C. This was called the insurance spiral, and people sued each other over where the losses actually needed to be borne for about 2 decades. So I thought this was fascinating, and I found out about this just as the credit crunch was breaking in the middle of 2007, and yes, it's been 5 years. And I thought to myself, maybe if I can understand that smaller, simpler financial crisis, I might be able to learn something about the crisis that we're facing today and how to prevent similar crises in future. And so I began to delve deeper. And one of the first things I discovered was an account of the event that caused those initial losses and triggered the reinsurance spiral. And that story begins on the 6th of July, 1988, where an engineer on the largest oil and gas platform in the North Sea was maintaining, repairing something called the secondary condensate pump. And at the end of his shift, you can't work a double shift on an oil rig, it's dangerous, you get tired, you make bad decisions. So at the end of his shift, he had to stop. And this pump wasn't actually in a usable condition. So he went to the control room of the rig to tell them not to use the secondary pump. But the control room was very busy, they were in the middle of some kind of shift handover. And so the engineer filled out a document called a permit to operate, saying the pump was unusable, and he left it in what he thought was a prominent position on somebody's desk where it would be seen, and he went to bed. And 2 hours later, the primary pump failed. And the operators in the rig's control room looked around to see if they could find any reason why the secondary pump couldn't be used. And they couldn't find any reason. They couldn't find any documentation. We're not quite sure why they didn't see the permit to operate. And the reason we don't know quite what happened is because almost everybody concerned died within a few hours of that decision. The secondary pump was switched on. High-pressure gas leaked out, set off several alarms, but almost immediately exploded. There was a huge fire now raging on the rig. The crew tried to switch off the flow of gas and oil to the hydrocarbon pipes near the fire, but that initial explosion had hurled debris across the rig, through a firewall, and severed another pipe and started another fire elsewhere on the rig. And that sort of cascade of events continued. Each new fire, each new explosion started more trouble, and it wasn't possible to shut down the flow of hydrocarbons quickly enough. Now, one thing that might have happened is, well, it's a North Sea oil rig. It's in the middle of cold water, so you could pump cold sea water up the legs of the rig and use it in a sprinkler system. You could douse these fires with massive amounts of water. The thing about oil rigs is they're very maintenance heavy. So there are often divers around the legs of these rigs. And you can't have a gigantic seawater pump suddenly come on with no notice because somebody burns the toast. It's too dangerous. You'll kill one of the divers, just be sucked into the pump, killed instantly. So you can't have the pumps come on automatically. You have to have somebody manually switch them on. And the manual switch was in the control room, and the control room was next to the secondary condensate pump. And the control room was pretty much destroyed by that first explosion, and those who survived the explosion had to immediately evacuate. And at that point, Piper Alpha was completely doomed. A series of explosions ripped through the rig, and the final fireball was so large it would have engulfed half the Eiffel Tower. 167 men died. And 2 of those men were actually in a boat coming towards Piper Alpha with 6 people that they'd rescued. That was how big the explosion was. The men who survived, rather than trying to get to the lifeboats, which they couldn't reach, rather than hiding in the accommodation platform, which was fireproof, but which ended up at the bottom of the North Sea, the men who survived had gone to the edge of the rig and looked down 10 stories into this deathly cold water and jumped. And the rig burned for 3 weeks. At the end of the 3 weeks, what was left of hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and engineering was something that just looked like a wilted bunch of flowers. And I read all this, and I realized that I'd been looking in the wrong place. Because if I really wanted to understand how to prevent crises in these very complex systems that surround us in the financial world, I shouldn't be looking at the insurance spiral. I should be looking at this terrible industrial accident that triggered it. Charles Perrault is a sociologist at Yale. He's in his 80s, and he's an expert on accidents and the social systems and the engineering systems that lead to accidents. In fact, elements of these systems make accidents almost inevitable. Perrault's most famous book is called Normal Accidents. It includes an account of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl and Challenger and Bhopal. And for Perrault, there are 2 elements of these systems that make them so fragile, so prone to these accidents, catastrophic accidents. And those 2 elements are complexity and tight coupling. Imagine just a row of dominoes. You flick the first one, they all go very quickly. Nothing you can do about it. Well, complexity leads to unintended consequences. And tight coupling means you have no time whatsoever to respond to those unintended consequences. And of course, Perrault was the first person to see that the financial system, like an oil rig, like a nuclear reactor, is also a complex and tightly coupled system. And when I spoke to him about this, he said, well, yeah, Tim, I've tried to apply my ideas to banking. There's just one problem. Banking is far more complicated than any nuclear reactor I ever studied. If we take seriously for a moment the idea that the psychologists, the sociologists, the engineers, who for decades have been trying to make these industrial systems safer and to understand how these tragedies happen, if we take seriously for a moment the idea that they may have learned something that we economists and accountants and lawyers who run the financial system, maybe we have something to learn. If we take that idea seriously, where does it take us? What are the lessons? Well, the first lesson, I think, is that safety systems do not necessarily make you safe. Piper Alpha, remember, was triggered at first by the safety regulation that the engineer couldn't work a double shift. And then the real doom loop set in when the seawater pumps couldn't be switched on. And again, that was a safety system. It was designed to protect divers. 3 Mile Island was triggered initially by a malfunctioning safety system. It was a false alarm. Effectively shut down the nuclear reactor and made it impossible to control. My favorite example actually inspired a song by Gil Scott-Heron, "We Almost Lost Detroit This Time." And that was because there was a report of a near meltdown of an experimental reactor, the Fermi reactor near Detroit, that concluded that had the reactor's operators not been able to control it, and they nearly did lose control, 65,000 people might well have died. What happened at Fermi, after the reactor started behaving in a really crazy way, and after the operators managed finally to get it under control, and finally to shut it down, and to cool it down, and a month after that, it was cool enough to start investigating, and they sent this long stick into the middle of the reactor vessel with a camera on the end. And at the bottom of the reactor vessel, they saw what looked like a crushed beer can, and it had blocked the exit, the drain from the reactor vessel, and meant that the coolant couldn't flow around the reactor vessel and keep the reactor rods cool enough. Homer Simpson at work, maybe. Then they sent in this claw on the end of this. I mean, this sort of 40-yard long stick they pushed into this thing, and their claw grabbed the beer can and pulled the thing out. And when they saw it, they realized it wasn't a beer can. It was a zirconium filter. And the zirconium filter was a safety system that wasn't even on the blueprints. It had been dislodged by this turbulent coolant. And the zirconium filter had been put into the reactor vessel at the last minute at the express request of the regulatory authorities. Safety systems do not necessarily make you safe. There are 2 reasons for this. One is risk compensation. You've got a safety system, you do crazy things, right? And there was a classic example of this in the financial crisis. One of the key problems in the crisis was the way that credit default swaps operated. Credit default swaps are a bit like insurance against somebody not paying their debts. And the first credit default swap was developed by JP Morgan with the express approval of the regulator and the express aim of allowing JP Morgan to take more risks. That was the whole point. Everybody agreed that was the whole point. And it's not entirely crazy. What is crazy is the idea that anybody thought that that would then make the system safer. I mean, if I agree to wear a seatbelt but drive twice as fast, I don't see why anybody thinks that makes me safer. Risk compensation. But I think more subtly and more importantly, these credit default swaps, like many systems, introduced new complexities and new ways for the system to fail. In the financial crisis, what was going on was you'd have a mind-your-own-business bank in the Midwest steering well clear of all these subprime mortgage products, holding a portfolio of pretty safe assets, but just to be extra safe, they'd buy a credit default swap from a major insurance company, and then they'd get the tip-top credit rating of the insurance company applied to their portfolio. And then one day, they would get a call from the regulator, and the regulator would say, well, you know the subprime market is completely melted down. And they'd say, well, that's nothing to do with us. He'd say, well, I'm afraid it is something to do with you, because your insurance company is about to go bankrupt. And that means your insurance company's credit rating no longer applies to your portfolio. And your portfolio is now no longer super safe, it's just quite safe. And that means you have to sell a bit of your portfolio to meet regulatory requirements. So the bank's risk officer would say, well, okay, fine, seems a bit strange to me, and would pick up the phone to Wall Street to sell some of these assets and would discover that every other bank in the country is trying to sell the exact same assets at the exact same time for the exact same reason. And that is tight coupling. And that is why safety systems don't necessarily make you safe. Okay. Well, if this Rube Goldberg-esque accretion of safety systems isn't necessarily the answer, what is? Well, I'm afraid I don't actually know. That's one of the reasons I came here to PopTech. But I've got a couple of suggestions. One is this very simple idea of hazard reduction. In engineering, say you've got a coolant system that works on ammonia. Well, ammonia is dangerous, and yeah, you could have alarms and containment vessels and so on, but basically it's dangerous. And if you could just reconfigure the system so it cooled with water instead of ammonia, that's hazard reduction. Well, the ammonia of the financial system is leverage. It's the extreme use of debt finance rather than equity finance. Debt finance is not resilient. Equity finance, I think, is. And the banks are currently locked in this huge argument with regulators as to how much they have to reduce leverage. And I would humbly suggest that this is an argument that the banks really desperately need to lose for the sake of all of us. That's maybe not a surprising conclusion. A lot of people have said that. What is a little more surprising, a bit more unusual, and this is my second idea, is the importance of good indicators of what is going on in these complex systems. 3 Mile Island was basically a nuclear near meltdown. It was fundamentally a problem with the indicators. The operators of 3 Mile Island at 4 o'clock in the morning were trying to make decisions in a room facing 700 blinking red and green lights. Some of the red lights were supposed to be red, some of the red lights were supposed to be green, some of the green lights were supposed to be green, and some of the green lights were supposed to be red. There were 100 alarms simultaneously sounding in that room. And there was a printer in the corner printing out, this is the late 1970s, printing out these status updates, what's going on in the plant. And it was 2 days behind because there was so much going on, the printer couldn't keep up. And in that circumstance, it's maybe not that surprising that an engineer looking at a very hard-to-read dial in a very confusing situation misread the dial, misdiagnosed the situation, and allowed 32,000 gallons of superheated radioactive water to jet out of the bottom of the reactor vessel and expose the rods themselves. Now, you can blame operator error if you like, but I blame poor design. And you would be surprised, I think, if you went to a modern nuclear power station, as I have, at how much effort goes into the very simple business of the ergonomics and the design of the control panels to just make them really simple, child-friendly, so it's very hard to make a mistake just because you pressed the wrong knob or misread a dial. In finance, the equivalent is really good, real-time, detailed, and yet somehow highly legible and intuitive measures of systemic risk. That's what regulators are now starting to talk about, I think the more foresighted regulators. Andrew Haldane, the head of financial stability at the Bank of England, that has this dream that we'll one day have this real-time data you can put on your Google glasses and you can see around you. It's like a constellation all around you, and you can see all the interconnections and all the stress points, and you can make real-time decisions. But he said, we're a million miles away from that now. The situation at the moment is, when Lehman Brothers went down, the regulators just had to guess who else might be affected. The same debates went on as the Eurozone was trying to understand whether to bail out Greece or not. Who would get hurt if Greece left the Eurozone? We just didn't know. We had to guess. We need to make progress on that. And one final idea. The psychologist James Reason, he's an expert on these accidents, he's an expert on human error. I love the idea that there's a guy called Reason who's an expert on human error. The psychologist James Reason talks about latent errors or latent conditions. So somebody leaves the valve in the closed position so that cold water can't be injected into the reactor vessel at 3 Mile Island. Somebody neglects to fill up the compressed air and the battery on the blowout preventer on Deepwater Horizon. And those latent conditions, those latent dangers are possibly there for days, for weeks, months, even years. And that's why you get these 1,000,000-to-1 events happening. What were the chances? Gosh, all the safety systems failed at the same time. Well, they didn't fail at the same time. Some of them failed years ago, but because they're safety systems, nobody checked, nobody realized. So how do we spot these latent errors, these latent dangers? Well, they're not spotted by inspectors, they're not spotted by auditors. They're basically always spotted by one group of people. That's the employees. And the employees are terribly vulnerable when they raise their hand and blow the whistle. Paul Moore was the chief group risk officer for the Royal Bank of for Halifax, Bank of Scotland, HBOS. 300-year-old institution, the largest mortgage lender in the UK. And Paul became very concerned about the lending standards of HBOS in 2004, 2005. When he looked into it, he said it was like a pressure cooker coming off when he started asking the employees about the pressures they felt and the bad lending decisions they were having to make. So he went to the board of HBOS and he reported his concerns, and the chairman thanked him. And then, well, we don't know exactly what happened. We only have Paul Moore's account. Paul Moore's account is that he was summoned to the office of James Crosby, the head of HBOS, and that Crosby just sacked him, like swatting a fly. And Paul Moore just staggered out of the building, out onto the street, sat down on a park bench, and began to cry. And less than 4 years later, HBOS first had to go into a shotgun marriage with Lloyds Bank because it was too weak to survive by itself. And then very shortly afterwards, the merged group had to accept £17 billion, about $25 billion worth of government bailout. Oh, and the deputy head of the Financial Services Authority at the time, Sir James Crosby, the man who sacked Paul Moore. If we're asking whistleblowers to identify latent conditions, latent errors in a system, we're asking them to make sacrifices on behalf of all of us. Maybe we need to ask a little less of them and give them a little more protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic.